Well, fáilteadh agus fáilte de chola duine a chunlar in seo nóg. Chun an tachartas seo tachartas íontachas anasach am céinteoch mas bí naíicheach. Tá maithar fécin, ge bíting háirní an thuúil is a bhfuil siú sin chunlaring. Welcome to this event. My name's Agnes Rennie. I live in Golson in the island of Lewis in the Hebrides of Scotland. And one of the things that I'm particularly involved in and probably led to my conversation with Lewis when she was doing her research is my role with the Community Land Trust here in Golson. And you'll see some mention of that if you've seen Lewis's report. But if not, just look at the map and you'll see where we are. More of that later, though. As Luke said, we're here tonight for an event titled Climate Resilience, a conversation about Dùthchas. Again, a Gaelic word that we'll come back to. And interestingly, when we mention Lewis's report, Gàidheil Resurgence and Indigenous Place-Based Knowledge in and of the Hebrides, Strengthening Climate and Cultural-Ecological Resistance. It's very unusual that actually the Gaelic title for this report is simply Dùthchas agus Dùthchas in Siúl na Gael. And there are one or two people who are here tonight, as well as myself and Peigi Ann, will know how very, very unusual it is that the Gaelic title is succinctly and shortly saying as much, if not more, than the English version. If you've not had the opportunity to read this fascinating report, then tonight's discussion will give you a flavour of some of the issues raised, the commonalities of shared cultural experience, and the extent to which today it continues to be the case that communities of place all over the world feel the impact of situations not of their own making. Tonight's event, as you've heard from Luke, is being hosted by the Centre for Human Ecology together with the Alliance for Intergenerational Resilience, and we're grateful for their support in publicising and running the evening, publicising it extremely successfully. So we look forward to the discussion as it progresses. Lewis has also asked me to acknowledge the support she received from the Institute for Northern Studies, UHI, and particularly the help shown by Professor Ulrich Kokel, who provided invaluable background information and introductions to possible contributors. And of course, the British Academy and Western University for funding the research, without which none of this would have been possible. If you've looked at the report, you may have noticed a short dedication in the frontispiece. This dedication was a heartfelt piece written by Lewis to acknowledge her gratitude to Sandra MacLeod from Adabroch in Lewis, who died very, very suddenly just shortly before the report was completed. Sandra was steeped in the culture and heritage of the place, and her range of interests in that regard were many and varied. It didn't matter whether it was healing wells or fairy knolls or landmarks or fishing marks. All of these were touched on by Sandra, and if you were caught with a cup of coffee, you heard all about them depending what the passion was on the day. Lewis was very sorry to have missed her further contribution to her research, and all of us miss her as a dear friend taken far too soon. Now, tonight's panel will, I'm sure, be thought-provoking and passionate. As to begin the evening, they each give us a short reflection on some of their experience and thoughts set against the themes emerging through Dùthchas agus Dùthchas in Siúl na Gael. I'll introduce them in turn as I call on them on speak, but just remind you now that after the panel has presented, we will have some time for conversation, after which I'll invite questions and comments from all of you who have joined us today. You don't have to wait until then. If you have a question or a thought, please feel free to put that in the chat. If you want to ask your question later on, please make that clear, and Luke and Anne will draw our attention to that. I can't promise that we can take everybody's questions. It's going to be a hard task, I think, given the number of people attending tonight. And I'm going to make a plea to you, if you are speaking, given that we have so many people with us, can you keep it short? Our three speakers tonight, our three panel members who will speak in the first instance, are Peigi Ann Sheilds from Braga and Lewis, Alistair McIntosh, who grew up in Lewis, and a third Lewis, Lewis Williams. How's that now for synchronicity? And I think there's a kind of poetic kind of rhythm to that too. So first of all, we called our youngest panel member tonight, and that's Peigi Ann Sheilds from Braga in Lewis. I've known Peigi. I think it's fair to say Peigi Ann won't mind me saying this all her life because she's co-ages with one of my own daughters. It's lovely to see that Peigi lives with her own family now in the village of Braga, where she and they, Gaelic speaking, or at least they will be very soon, I'm sure, Peigi Ann. So over to you.
Moran thank Agnes, Fesker Machul Dunye. Hello everyone, my name's Peigi Ann, and as Agnes said, I live in Braga on the Isle of Lewis. I'm 28 years old. I've lived in Braga all my life. I'm Indigenous to the area. My family have been here for many, many generations. I am a fluent Gaelic speaker. Gaelic was my first language. And something that I'm very passionate about. I have two small children and they will both be growing up as Gaelic speakers as their first language. I thought it would be appropriate to also introduce myself through my patronymic, which Lewis touched on through her report. So in my village, I'm known as Peigi Ann Nín Chotrine Chonihisak Vorochi Chadam Anakoi. And that goes back 7 generations. So my children now, their patronymic goes back 8 generations. So fair to say, we've been here a long, long time. I met Lewis. She came to the place where I work in Braga, a place called Gàidhealtachd, which is a community-owned charity and social enterprise. It was the old school, which shut. Many things in our village shut. And when it did shut, our community took it over. They raised a lot of money, renovated it, and turned it into a community hub for the village. So it's a grassroots organisation, and I do a lot of the Gaelic and community and events works there, which is very fulfilling and brilliant to be involved in my own community. My background is in Gaelic. I have a degree from UHI in Gaelic and Development, which takes in history, politics, language policy. I did a lot of learning about other minority cultures as well. So I found Lewis's report extremely, extremely interesting. I now work in Gaelic in community and also in communications. I'm very fortunate to live in such a Gaelic community, still a great community. I'm a keen crofter as well. I've got animals, and I would say I still live quite a traditional lifestyle, although I do like to travel and get out and see the world. I'm keeping it short because we've only got 10 minutes. I wanted to touch just on 3 themes of the report that really resonated with me. And I thought we'd go straight to the heavy stuff. And I'd like to just talk a little bit about the connection to land, Dùthchas and Dùthchas, just as the title of the report. I feel like this concept is very accepted when it comes to other minority cultures, their connection with the land. You would never question a Native American's connection to their land. I feel like this is something that isn't so well known or well talked about with Gaels, but we also have the same connection to our land. In the report, Lewis touched a bit on the question, Kwasahau, where are you from? I would answer that. I would say Bunyamito Vragath, which translates as I belong to Braga. The place doesn't belong to us, we belong to the place. And it's such an amazing thing. And I'm extremely privileged to have such a connection to the land. I am pretty confident to say that if something did happen to my home, if I had to leave this place for any reason, my soul would never recover. The connection is so strong. And I really think we as Gaels do not talk about this enough, our strong connection to land. I feel some urban people now are so detached from the land, from the earth. We aren't as detached yet. I often think about my grandfather. His first cousin lives just a couple of doors up from me in our village. He's in his 80s, and he often talks about when he was a young boy, they actually depended on the crops they grew on my croft, which I own now, to live. So there's only 50 years between myself and Roddy John. So we haven't moved away from the land as quickly as people in other places. We haven't lost that connection so quickly. And I think a theme of the report and a message that Lewis was trying to convey, which really resonates with me, is if you look after your place on earth, the earth is better for it, and your place is better for it. People here lived off the land as until about 50 years ago. They looked after it and they respected the land, and they had such a deep connection with it. And I think we still definitely have that. If everyone on earth was still like that and respected the land that way, I don't think there would be climate change as there is now, in my opinion. Brings me on to the next topic, which Lewis touched on briefly in her report. There's lots going on in Lewis at the moment. We're facing quite mass industrialisation, the closest one to my home being a very large offshore wind farm owned by a Canadian company, 4.5 kilometres off the coast, and all these over about 360 metres tall above sea level, so all taller than the Eiffel Tower. There's also lots of onshore developments in various stages of planning. All this power not staying in Scotland, going to England. Lewis touched on this, but I think I wanted to go a bit deeper into this topic. We live in such an amazing place. I think the best in the world, if you ask me. But from the time of James VI, outside authorities have taken an interest in Lewis generally to extract our resources, and not much has changed today. Lewis spoke quite a lot in her report about the clearances, and this, I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I do feel in some ways that the Highland clearances are happening again, but just in a different form. There's so much plans for renewable energy and infrastructure all over the Highlands and Islands. When you see the full plan of it, it's quite frightening. And it really made me think. Sandra gave a quote in the report, if anyone's had a chance to read it, really resonated with me. She said, "The clearances on Lewis went on for decades. You've always got it at the back of your mind that it could happen again. And it did happen again and again, and you're not in charge anymore. Your locus of control is now external to you, and it belongs to someone who's not connected to your culture, doesn't know your language, and doesn't care about any of it." And that really resonated with me because it's actually a feeling that I feel quite often. Lewis also spoke a lot about generational trauma, and that definitely plays a part in it. We have a lot of deep trauma in Lewis, spanning back from the time of World War I, the Islair disaster, immigration, and that's definitely something that's been very, very evident in the people. And I was quite shocked to read, well, shocked and not shocked, when you mentioned, Lewis, in the report about the high rates of cardiovascular illnesses, which is increased levels of cortisol in the blood, which is a stress response. Because actually, as a young Gael, I feel a lot of stress all the time. And I do think it's maybe something that's in us, and it is possibly connected to the generational trauma. And also a feeling of hianalis, which is a Gaelic word that it's quite difficult to explain in English, but if I was to move to the other side of the world, to New Zealand, where Lewis is now, I would feel Cianalus for my home all the time. That longing, that wanting to go home. But actually, as a young Gael living here, it's something that I feel most days. It's a funny one to explain. I guess it goes hand in hand with that stress that we feel. The place, we're so connected to it. You don't, every day you're closer to losing it, and it does cause stress. But we feel, I think people here, we feel our responsibility to the land. You know, we are the custodians of this place. It doesn't belong to us, but we look after it for future generations. My mum told me a story that I think is quite appropriate about my grandpa one year in the peats. We cut peats here in Lewis, and my grandpa didn't cut a bank because there was a duck in the bank with ducklings. So he left the bank alone so the ducklings could thrive. And then once the duck and the ducklings had moved out, he could cut the bank again. But I think it's the exact same thing. We, as the people here, are looking after the land for the next generation, which is such a beautiful thing. And when you fill the land or the sea with borrow pits or cement, you are destroying it forever. People talk a lot about the views being ruined, but I think that's very superficial. It's a lot deeper than that. When you damage the land, you damage the soul. I know often when I'm out at my peats, there was a large-scale development that was supposed to go ahead here about 20 years ago, which some of the panelists here tonight were involved in stopping. And I always feel very thankful because where my peats are, it was going to be destroyed. And especially now since I've had children, seeing them out there, seeing my daughter playing there, I'm so thankful that it's still there and she can learn and I can pass on the traditions to her, which I think is so important. So I'm very thankful that it's still there. I'm thankful for it every day. So as a young girl, as a young mother now, I also feel that same responsibility to protect our home for the next generations because it really is such a magical and special place. I wanted to finish just on a positive. I felt there was some negativity coming through from the older generation that were interviewed. Again, not their fault. It's that mentality has been very much drilled into them. But we as young Gaels today, I find that the narrative has changed. I'm not sure why. Is it because we went through Gaelic medium education and Gaelic now to us is an extremely positive thing. We had so many opportunities in Gaelic, but it's so wonderful to see. I have such an amazing community of friends that also have children that are teaching their children Gaelic as their first language, that have strong connections to the land. There's plenty of young people here fighting to have a life here. It would be very easy for us to move to the mainland. Our life would be easier, but we are deciding to stay here to teach our children Gaelic and to teach them all our traditions. So I think there is a shift happening. We can't see it at the moment, but I'm hoping when my daughter is my age that the shift will be very evident towards the positive. So I just want to finish by saying thank you so much to Lewis for this really interesting report. I really enjoyed reading it.
Thank you so much, Peigi. Gàidhealtachd son na Gàidhealtachd Human point Thank you so much, Peigi Ann. A lot of points there really linking in with Lewis's report, which I was also got lost in reading. I must be honest. But for now, can we move to Alistair McIntosh? As I said earlier, Alistair grew up in Lewis, was not born in Lewis, as he is always very keen to remind us, but he did grow up in Lewis, and I think he won't mind me saying that he carries that heritage with him wherever he goes as a citizen of the world. Alistair.
Thank you so much, Agnes, and I think it's very important to acknowledge where we're coming from in this. You mentioned the the Institute for Northern Studies at UHI, and Uli Cockle and Mairead McCrath, who are on with us tonight. And Lewis and I got to know each other when she invited me over to Saskatchewan. And one outcome of that was that Ashgate, as it was, now Routledge, it invited me to edit a book on human ecology. I didn't have time to take it on properly, but Lewis became the principal editor along with Rose Roberts, an Indigenous North American, and Lewis herself. And we produce this. But one of the papers in this is from Uli Cockle of now of the University of Highlands and Islands, in which he talks about a German word Heimat, which in some ways is quite similar to Dùthchas. He defines it as knowledge of the historical ecology of belonging, and suggests that this is about a deeper understanding of what it means to be a human being through the wisdom that sits in place. So I just wanted to mention that by way of thanking somebody who's been an elder to a number of us who are on this Zoom tonight. In fact, there's a number of elders. I see Michael Newton there coming in from North Carolina, whose work, Warriors of the World, and various other books have been so important to us. I'm struck that I met Peigi Ann for the first time, having communicated with her mother, Katrina Campbell, in Braga in 2009, when I was walking the lengths from the south of Harris to the north of Lewis. And I met up with them at Champel Ian, St. John's Temple or Chapel in the between Braga and Shawburst there. And at that time, Peigi Ann was not yet a teenager. She was there with her mother. And yet already I could sense the degree to which a tradition bearer was in the making. And we stood and looked at her grandmother's tombstone, which was in the old part of the cemetery. And Peigi Ann talked a little bit about her grandmother, and you could just feel that intergenerational flow, what we call the carrying stream in Scotland, flowing on. And so some words from a Fife poet, Barney McCormack, a coal miner who I used to know. Child, go break off from the herd, go beyond the lowlands, leave the valley of shed antlers. The elders are sick. It is your time now. I think this is a quite astonishing and important report that Lewis Williams has written with the collaboration of so many people, many of you here today. And sadly, the loss of our dear friend Sandra MacLeod, who Varen, my wife, and I last met in 2021 at Furan Storth, the healing well right in the north of Lewis, where she leaned down and took a cup and gave us a cup of water from that well. Her uncle, the famous Dr. Finlay MacLeod, who has written on the healing wells and chapels of the islands, albeit being the island's most notorious atheist at the time, a title now taken over by Agnes's husband, Frank Rennie. Her uncle, writing of that well, said, "It is not all that long since people gave up visiting this well. But if only he knew his own niece was going and cleaning it regularly. And he himself, just before he died, reopened St. Andrew's Well. And I have it on Sandra's authority that Dr. Finlay danced a little dance 3 times clockwise around the well when the water began to flow after having been blocked for so long. And that sense of old wells that have become blocked being freed up again so that the carrying stream can carry on flowing. For me, there were 3 main things that stood out in this report. I'll call them the 3 C's: colonialism, the Gaelic, women's power, and climate change. It's been very difficult for us to use what I call the C word in a context of Scottish history because of the politics surrounding it. There is much debate amongst academic historians as to whether it is proper to use it at all in a Scottish context. But I think in the light of scholarship over the past 20 years or so, there is no doubt that it is a fitting term to use in the context of the Highlands and Islands, particularly if you consider what I call the three I's and the letter I of colonization. Imperial colonization of territory, and we're only partly talking about that here. Internal colonization in the sense that sociologists like Michael Hector use the word, meaning when one part of a country colonizes the resources of another, what we were just hearing about from Peigi Ann with the wind issue there. And least recognized, but most important of all, psychologically and spiritually, inner colonization. So imperial, internal, and inner, what I think of as the three I's of colonization. And I think what this report really does is it opens that inner colonization up. That sense of Lewis naming what she calls white epistemological supremacy. I wasn't quite sure, Lewis, if you'd got that from one of the reports you were referencing, or if that was your term. Maybe you might put us right on that. But I took it as being your term as used there. White epistemological supremacy. Epistemological, the theory of what does and does not count as knowledge and how you get to it. And so, as is very clearly expounded in the report, the Gàidhealtachd has been subjected to a process, as James Hunter, the crafting historian, puts it, of inferiorization, by which we grew up being raised to think that the best thing we could do was get on in order to get out. And speaking of Gaelic, was, to be fair to our teachers, encouraged in the home, but my schoolfellows in Lurba School were told not to speak the Gaelic in the playground, but to learn it from the 3 out of 19 of us in the class who spoke English fluently. And so I grew up, and I still carry with me the blocked psychology of a blockage towards the Gaelic language. I'm very poor at Gaelic, at languages anyway, but I have a particular difficulty remembering even the most basic things in Gaelic. And I think it goes beyond linguistic ineptness. I think there is a psychological issue there. And I've talked with other people like myself who similarly describe that situation. I want to move away from colonization now to the Cailleach, what Lewis talks about, the wise old woman. It's striking that the Gaelic word for a nun is Cailleach, the black old woman, supposedly because the Augustinian nuns in the Hebrides wore black habits. Although when I look at the number of place names that have sacred associations and the word black associated with them, words like Knockdhu, the black little hill, and so on, I wonder if there's a deeper sacred meaning from pre-Christian times behind that use of black. And I think of the Cailleach, you know, that triune goddess singers, Robert Graves called it, the maiden, the mother, the crone, or hag, or Cailleach, the wise old woman, that cycle of womanhood. Seeing it very clearly here. You have Peigi Ann, the maiden, now a mother. You have women here in midlife, and you've got women here towards the end of their lives. And the reason I'm mentioning that is that whenever I take people around community land trusts in Scotland, especially in the Hebrides, like I did with a delegation from Loch Ness back in November last year, I am struck by how much these land trusts are being run by women, Agnes being a case in point, being the chair of the Golson Trust there, and how wonderfully competently, and to use a word that my own wife Veren would use a lot in her work, what wonderful collaborative leadership these women bring into how they work with these organizations, working with men, of course. But I'm struck by the way, I speak in a number of different contexts, in many contexts in Britain, Europe, and the world. And so often I'll be looking at the lineup and I'll be saying, well, you've got a manel here, an all-male panel. Where are the women? Where are the people of color, etc.? And they'll say, well, we just can't get anybody. But that is never the case with land reform in Scotland. In Scotland, it's the other way around. In my experience, you've been struggling to find a good man to speak on a panel rather than a woman. So I want to mention that as coming through in Lewis's report. And finally, because our time is running out and we need plenty of time for discussion, climate change. And I was struck by the way that Peigi Ann said, and she so often says things like this, when you damage the land, you damage the soul. And she said, if we had lived with the wisdom of our Dùthchas, our heritage in the land, and a related word, if we live with the wisdom of our Dùthchas, our heritage in people, the people that we are from, if we lived with that wisdom, then as the late Norman MacLeod of Bridge House in Harris put it to me, then the commandment, thou shalt honour thy mother and father, which is important in Presbyterian parts of Scotland, takes on a whole new meaning, because to use that commandment in full, thou shalt honour thy mother and father, so that thy days shall be long in the land that the Lord has given to you. Or as I would double translate that, thou shalt honour, and this is prompted by Norman, who said mother and father here means much wider than just your parents. It means the people you are from in the Jewish tradition, and likewise in the Gaelic tradition. Thou shalt honour thy Dùthchas, thy people who you're from, so that thy days shall be long in the Dùthchas, in the heritage of land that the Lord has given to you. So for me, these were the main points that came out of this report. I'm very struck that it has been led by, going back to the Gaelic again, to women's power. I'm very struck that it has been initiated by a woman scholar from a cross-cultural Dùthchas in New Zealand, Scotland, Maori, whites, etc. I'm very struck by that. And also I'm struck by the way in which Lewis's work has drawn out the feminine voice, which is so important in the issues that we face, because we are not going to solve climate change by bringing on more and more forms of power, whether alternative or conventional. We are only going to solve climate change by reconnecting with what it means to be human beings in relationship, in community with one another. And that is why these community land trusts are so important, because they restore not just the natural ecology, but also the human ecology. Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair. Now, don't tell anybody that I passed you that tenner regarding land trusts.
Well, you're doing such good work on that, Agnes. You know,
we've been literally singing from the same.
I visited you with the Lough Neagh people, and we were just blown away at what you folks are achieving when a community has got access to its resources and is able to harvest those resources, like with your own relatively small yet very profitable community wind turbine. It's able to provide housing for the people in the community, and yet not destroy the place, but rather regenerate the place.
Community is the absolutely magic word in that situation, but we can come back to that later. That's what makes that so different from what was being described by Peigi Ann, and it makes a world of difference. So without further ado, let's now conclude the presentations from the panel with the person who's caused us to be here this evening, and that's Lewis Williams. Lewis, can I invite you please now to say your few words and take the floor.
Kia ora. Thank you, Agnes. Tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi mahana ki ngā iwi o Te Gàidhealtachd. So my very warm greetings, particularly to people of the Gàidhealtachd and to everyone who was here tonight from different corners of our earth. I want to express my deep thanks for the way that no report is a single effort. Nothing is a single effort. And I want to express my deep thanks for this collaborative effort and for everyone who has contributed. I speak to you today from Aotearoa, from the traditional territory of Ngāti Whātua, my own iwi Ngātarangi, 3 hours down the coast in the Tauranga Moana. For a good part of the year, I live and work on the territory of the Deshkan of Turtle Island, Canada, and that's the colonial name for that town is London, and the traditional peoples there, the traditional territories are the territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Lenape. So acknowledging them as well. I also want to acknowledge my dear friend Ian McKinnon, who is caring and is hosting, and his love and deep caring for this topic has fed into this, and his support. And also Ryan, for your careful going through the report. And Uli, for your wonderful hosting and minded. So without much further ado, I also want to acknowledge my mother, Shirley, who's just in the next room, and both my Ngātarangi and my Gaelic whakapapa run through my mother, who is now 89, so very, very much an elder. I want to speak to two key points about in my talking today. And the first thing I want to speak to is why I wrote this report and the place in me that it's come from. And then the second thing I want to talk to is, I think, its relevance to the global Gaelic diaspora and its relevance to all of our futures and the well-being, our collective well-being, the well-being of the earth, so that it's perhaps its broader relevance. My whakapapa, or my genealogy. So in Te Ao Māori, we have a word called whakapapa. Whakapapa is simply the genealogical connection between all entities, so human and more than human. And in the human sense, my genealogical connections to this report, in terms of the Gàidhealtachd, are through the Isle of Arran. I also have Lowland Scots ancestry or Central Belt down south of Glasgow and Lesmahago. And then, of course, the other important part that I come from in writing this report is my Ngātarangi ancestry, or my Māori ancestry. And both the Gaelic and the Māori ancestry come together for me in Tauranga Moana. That's where the common ancestry is. So that's a very important point. And I started to write this, to research this, because I wanted to know what had happened to my Gaelic ancestors. And I wanted to know both about that displacement and the indigeneity. I grew up very disconnected from both my Māori and my Gaelic roots. Of course, that's on the other side of the world. And in me was a deep longing to be connected, more than in that everyday sense, that deep spiritual belonging. And I think that was around the quiet trauma, what Ian McKinnon talks about, the quiet trauma of colonization, that deep longing in the soul to know where your tūranga waiwai is, to know where your your place of power, your standing place, your connection to Papatūānuku, the earth. And I want to say that in Māori cosmology, we are descended both from Papatūānuku and the Ranganui. Papatūānuku was the earth mother, and the Ranganui is the sky father. We are the progeny of them, and that's incredibly earth-centered. So I did actually find my way back to my Ngātarangi people, and that is a whole another journey. But certainly in a Māori, and what I wanted to do in this research was to really highlight this deep connection that is held, this Dùthchas, this Indigenous connection to the land that is held by people, some people's living in the Gàidhealtachd, particularly Lewis and Skye and other islands. And one way that I could do that was thinking about this concept of whakapapa. And we live in a world where our genealogical connections, our connections to others, to other beings are very much fractured. And we need to heal this whakapapa. We need to heal these connections. So another reason and Indigenous knowledge is so badly needed. I think that this research or this gathering that I've done in terms of Skye and Lewis is also very poignant because geophysically, the Gàidhealtachd is very close to the heart of empire in terms of where colonization actually came out from, right? The British Empire. It's very, very close physically. And this close connection to the land, this indigeneity, I think in any part of the world is worth fighting for. And it's so needed. And I think that this is a very powerful thing, that this Dùthchas, this connection to the land is so strongly held in this part of the Gàidhealtachd. I think that's very powerful. I'll just now move on a bit to the relevance to global Gael diaspora. So both in Canada and in New Zealand, and my own ancestors included, when they immigrated, quickly, because of being white, were able to assimilate into psychologically and materially into the colonial structures and lost that sense of indigeneity. When I teach students in Canada, I teach Indigenous studies, I teach Indigenous knowledge and traditions, and I have people who are both Indigenous to Turtle Island and people who were not Indigenous to Turtle Island. One of the things I always ask the people who are not Indigenous to Turtle Island, who often will have either a Gaelic Scottish or Gaelic Irish ancestry, I say, who are your people? Who are your people? Where were your people from? What Indigenous traditions did your people practice? And I ask them this question because in order to be good treaty partners or to really be in relationship to the Indigenous peoples of the place that they are living, they need to not just support that at a head level, but they need to deeply understand in their soul, in their being, what Indigenous knowledge is. And once they can start to relate to their own ancestry and those processes of colonization and quiet trauma, the trauma of being cut off from one's sense of Indigenous self, they then start to come into more of a relationship with the Indigenous peoples of that place. Now, I'm going to mention one organisation here in Aotearoa called Gathering at the Gate. And I'm mentioning this because it's really key. Its key aim is actually it says, a collective inquiry into ancestral recovering and honouring Te Tiriti o Waitangi for Pākehā, white assimilated folks. So people are beginning to realise the importance of really linking into where are they from, their whakapapa. And only by finding one's tūranga waiwai, one's standing place, one's place where or the places where you can be powerful, are you going to be able to be, I think, an embodied, grounded activist for Papatūānuku or Mother Earth, where we need to be going next. We have, Agnes, tell me, how many more minutes have I got?
Two.
Okay. So,
but given your role, I might give you 3.
Okay. So we recently we've been through this terrible debacle in Aotearoa, New Zealand, around the Treaty Principles Bill. Essentially, it was to disestablish the Treaty of Waitangi, the founding document of New Zealand, and to basically individualise self-determination. This the Māori notion of collective self-determination in kaitiakitanga was to individualise this and give every individual self-determination in a very individualistic neoliberal sense. Thankfully, the bill didn't make it through, but there were many submissions made. And the key politician who put it forward was actually of Māori and Scots descent, so totally cut off from his indigeneity. There were many submissions on the Treaty Principles Bill, and I'm going to read you the tail end of Heather Robinson's submission, which I think encompasses a lot of what I'm wanting to convey here. So she's the head of the Auckland City Mission. She says, "You are looking at a living, breathing example of the result of a literal marriage between the colonizer and the colonized. Myself and my family across generations have received the privileges of that colonization. Just over 18 months ago, I stood with my sister outside of our marae, and that's the Māori meeting place, and I'm yet able to go in. So when I talk about the trauma, I feel that viscerally in my body. And I have heard the heart's longing for return and for restoration. And perhaps the most poignant thing about this story is not so much that my or our story, is that I know that this is shared across hundreds of thousands of people in our country in a longing for a return home, to a restoration for a way that could be. And I repeat, for a longing for a return home and a restoration for a way that could be. I think that applies to humanity. I think this is, and what Alistair talked about earlier, what it means to be a human being. In Gaelic terms, Dùthchas is at the heart of that. Māori terms, whakapapa, tūranga waiwai. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you very much, Lewis. Thank you so much to the 3 of you for these really, really thought-provoking presentations, and responding to your Alistair and Peigi Ann responding to your own report there, Lewis. Can I see that there's one request for a question, and I'll come to Mairit Ikra very, very shortly, Mairit, to hear your question. But first of all, just a couple of pickups on my own part. Peigi Ann, can I come back to you first of all? And I think it's really quite important to hear you describe your own relationship with the land and your relationship with that you want your children, you want to share with your children in terms of their relationship with their Dùthchas and Dùthchas. And one of the themes that came through for me from Lewis's report was a recurring reference to intergenerational knowledge transmission. Indeed, you've just spoken of it there, Lewis, in your presentation, and to some extent, Alistair touched on it too. I wonder, Peigi Ann, in your closing comments and your reference to your network of other young families, if you see that intergenerational knowledge transmission is actually alive and well as it stands at the moment. Time doesn't stand still, of course. So I'm not saying is it the same as you got, or even the same as your mother got, because that would be crazy too. So what does it mean for you today?
Well, I would say, in my experience, it's definitely changed, but change is healthy. But I do think there is a lot more intergenerational transmission of knowledge than people think. I feel a lot today, if you don't see things on social media, there's kind of a concept that it's not happening. But certainly what I have found with young people my own age, young families, traditional way of life is actually becoming cool again. Music, speaking Gaelic. I mean, most kids in the Western Isles now, they go into Gaelic medium first. You have to opt out into English. I don't know many people now that are opting out. Crofting, which is a very traditional way of life, keeping sheep, cows, that's becoming very cool again. I was at an event at our local auction mart and it was absolutely stowed out. I couldn't believe how many young people actually are interested in these things. So I would say it's different, but I would say that it's still alive, and I do feel very positive that when my own daughter is my age in about 30 years, that we'll be looking back, and it's around this time now that there is a shift going on. It's not so evident just now because it's happening, but I do think when we look back that there is going to be a shift in the way we're a lot more positive, we're a lot more confident young Gaels, and I really think that makes such a difference. We don't have this experience which Alistair talked about, that Gaelic is a negative thing, that we shouldn't be speaking it. We've always grown up being encouraged, and that Gaelic is a great thing, it's a great skill to have. So I do think things are changing, and we're going to see the effects of that soon.
So moving to you, Alistair, and kind of picking up on the same theme, why is it that there's such a resistance from some in regards to the use of the word Indigenous amongst Scottish people?
Well, my good friend Ian McKinnon, who I think has now joined the call here, he wrote a paper quite a number of years ago on indigeneity and crofting. And at the time, that got quite a lot of pushback, just as when I was using the word in my own work, it got pushback. Back in the 1990s, the pushback that I got is, we're not like blacks. It was quite a racist, internalized critique that came over. We're not Native Americans, we are trying to be like every other mainstream British person, kind of stuff. But what's happened in the years since then is that there's been an awakening and a recognition. What was that expression that Lewis used earlier? A recognition of white epistemological supremacy, and that we had, in Paulo Freire's sense, the Brazilian educator's sense, we had internalized our own colonization so that we wanted to be like the colonizer, so to speak. For me, growing up in a family, part Scottish, part English, I saw it very clearly from both sides. I became very embarrassed about the English side. Now I make a point of pointing out that I was born in Doncaster and lived there for the first 4 years of my life, because I think it is so important to say that if you listen to people of place and listen to place, and you serve rather than push your way in, then you will be drawn in. In the Gaelic tradition, as Alexander Carmichael points out, the first duty is hospitality for the short term, and the second duty is fostership or adoption for the long term. But that fostership can only come about if it is based on respect for what is found there.
Thanks, Alsted. I think my own kind of trying to understand that resistance chimes very much with your own thoughts there, and I have come across that as an explanation. Lewis, moving to something entirely different, can I ask you to reflect for a second on and look back on the period of research for this report? Was there something that really stood out for you that you had not expected while you were amongst the Gaels of the islands of Scotland? Is that a tough question? You're muted, by the way, Lewis. Please unmute.
Okay. I would say, reflecting, I think, no, I think actually, maybe I was surprised by how long, and of course I shouldn't be, but I was surprised. It took me a long time to get the context, Agnes, and to really understand in a deeper level the whole context of colonization. I can remember, some of my most memorable times is the feeling of the land, and I was surprised actually one day when, and this was after I actually was no longer physically in the Gàidhealtachd, but I was interviewing Fiona, your daughter, and we were talking about trauma and the trauma of that bleak feeling, and walking amongst the ruins. And I was actually taken aback, and I'd taken back to a memory of being on Lewis, and I've been reminded by Cara Smith that I was actually looking at a site of trauma because these were cleared ruins. And then later, a few months later, when talking with Fiona and talking about this whole thing of intergenerational trauma and colonization, I started crying myself. And I was taken aback because it triggered me in terms of what I was feeling and what I feel from time to time in terms of my Ngātarangi homelands and the healing that I have had to do with that. So I guess to answer your question in a long roundabout way, there's something about the reverberation of that trauma that I was a little bit taken back by. I was not surprised for the hospitality and the warmth. And I will say, I met Sandra and I in a very short space of time. We met 3 times for several hours, and she was so patient and just so wanting the good of her people. So yeah, no, that's my roundabout answer to your question.
That's fine. That's a good answer. I'll take one of the questions from our audience now, and Myrid, can I invite you to ask your question, please?
Okay, Cogardaslat Lewis, that is a fantastic report. My question relates to the issue raised by you, Agnes, in your question, which is about the concept of indigeneity, in which Ian McKinnon has written so brilliantly on. It arises from an experience I had of writing an essay for a Finnish publication in the last year, where I talked about Irish as an Indigenous language, and I was absolutely slaughtered by the reviewer for daring to call Irish an Indigenous language. In fact, my essay was described as a colonial act in my doing that. Now, I suspect the reviewer was a Sami. It doesn't matter who it was. But my question relates to resistance to the concept of indigeneity in the case of Gaels from Indigenous peoples. Like the Maori, or are there different reactions? Is there an acknowledgement of commonality, etc.
Alistair, is that specific to Lewis?
Well, it's dealt with kind of pretty brilliantly in Lewis, but anybody to answer it, please, yeah.
Well, maybe in the first instance, just to allow folk who haven't read the report themselves, just a flavour, Lewis, of your own response to Mairead's question. You're muted.
So Mairead, if I get you rightly, your question is around the some people's aversion to the use of indigeneity by say Irish Gael, or I mean I think it's complex. I mean I've applied 3 times to get some funding to do some research in the Gàidhealtachd between the Gàidhealtachd Canada and New Zealand, and have been turned down every time because they won't consider that the Gaels are Indigenous.
Right. Okay.
Yep. So I'll give you a starting point on that. I think actually what I'm experiencing is that there's greater receptivity to this idea in Aotearoa here. I think Turtle Island seem to be in another place with that. I think colonization is very complex because of there's been so many civilizations, and I had to in terms of my own research for this report, I had to go through to really come to an understanding of the indigeneity of the people of the Gàidhealtachd. I read widely around the geophysical history, the glaciation, how the Gaels came to be. I looked at DNA research. So I went right into it, and I came to yes, they are Indigenous, all apart from the criteria of that there's not yet collective recognition and particularly at the institutional levels to qualify under UNDRIP. And that's all about colonization. For me, indigeneity is about lived epistemologies. It's about lived ways of being and practicing those time-honored ways of being, that practicing the knowledge of the land. So that's my short answer there to some of what you're talking about. I'll let someone else chip in.
Alistair, can I maybe ask you if you want to add anything to what you said previously on this topic?
I think it's about the way we are conditioned growing up to frame reality. When I was in school, the map of the world, a good half of it was red, and we felt proud of that. That was our empire. We felt proud of the Union Jack. And I remember, I was born in 1955. I remember 1992, the first time I went to the Republic of Ireland. And it's almost embarrassing to say this, but I was surprised that they didn't still in some way think of themselves as British. Because we were never taught about British colonization of Ireland. We were never taught about that brutality. We never heard a thing about the famine or the clearances in our education. But I do remember we had a history teacher in the Nicholson Institute. I'm afraid I can only remember her nickname, and it wasn't exactly complimentary. So I just thank the history teacher in question when she taught us about the enclosures in England. And I felt a huge sense of injustice. And it wasn't really until Runrig, the Isle of Skye folk rock band, got going that I started to wake up to there being something in our culture. And then slowly it opened up and up and up, and consciousness transforms.
Thanks, Elsa. Some really, really interesting comments in the chat section if you're following these on the topic. Thank you, everybody who's contributed so far. Peigi Ann, just before we leave this one, I just wonder for yourself as a young person, where do you stand on this question of indigeneity? We touched on a wee bit earlier, but I think it's quite interesting. Does your generation respond to the topic in a different way from what possibly mine and Alistair's would have done?
Well, It's actually something I've thought about quite a lot in recent years. It's quite a hot topic, especially in Scotland, and especially, you know, are people, native Gaelic speakers in the community here, are we Indigenous? And I just think and you know, it's difficult because a lot of people do take offense when you answer this question. For me personally, I find that difficult to get my head around because we are Indigenous and that's just a fact. Um, so that's where I stand in it. I see myself, my own identity. I would never say to anyone that I was British. Like that is not even in my mind. I'm a Gael first, and then I'm Scottish. I would never describe myself as being British. So that's something that's maybe slightly different, but it is. There's a lot about this just now. I think it's a lot of it comes down to your worldview and the way you see the world. But for me personally, for myself, I'm definitely Indigenous, and to me that is just a fact.
You're Indigenous to place and you're Indigenous to Bragg.
Yes, definitely. Directly to Braga.
I get that, but not Bragg, as you might understand. We have a question from, and forgive me, Aidan. Can you ask your
Ugen. Is
Aidan?
Misha Ugen. Ugen. Hashin Kerst.
Am I kerst?
Ugen. Hashin Kerst. So, leva.
Na fónig go just Aidan
Okay. Oh, Bimi Gulua. So, my question is, has anyone ever come across the discussion of involvement in Gael's, in my research when it comes to Gael's involvement with the slave trade? They tend to group Gaels in with Scottish people, lowlanders, things like that. What I'm looking for is when Gaels have lost our language, how did that impact our involvement with things like that? And hurt people. And I feel that the loss of the Indigenous language is that loss of that connection to the culture, to the land, for whatever reason. Has anyone ever looked at some of these things? My other question to it, as somebody who I recently had to move out of the state of Idaho, where my family had lived for 8 generations, we had Dùthchas there. I mixed I'm enrolled Cherokee and Gael, so I have this displacement on both sides and intergenerational trauma. Now, I had to move out of Idaho because they made all the anti-trans laws. And as a Gaelic speaker, I'm unable to find a sponsorship to move to the UK. The only thing that has caused ease of the pain I feel is being involved with the language. The more involved I am with the language, the less pain I feel, but I can't get home. They don't give sponsorship to people who know how to tan hides and have these sort of skills. I mean, act the hiking, my vehicle, I see you. But you know, so it's been really difficult. So how do we ease these pains so we don't continue the harm? And then lastly is, I think it's something that comes from America, especially, I'm going to admit, I see it at the Highland Games. I think a lot of the reason that the indigeneity of Gaels is not accepted is because of how Americans are entering spaces of indigeneity, saying they're from someplace without having that connection. It's causing a lot of disruption. I call it, when I go to the Highland Games, I call it someone puts on a kilt. They wrap their supremacy up in a kilt and call it culture. And there seems to be, there's not enough platform given to culture bearers to educate, and there's not enough direction. So as an Indigenous Turtle Islander, what I run into in my communities is trying to educate, no, Gaels are Indigenous, but not all Scottish people have that Indigenous mindset because they are not involved with the language or the culture. And so it's trying to get people to realize that the government isn't the people. And especially when we're dealing with, you know, BIPOC Indigenous people who have had so much harm, there's not really, your feelings are not going to be logical. They're not going to respond logically. So trying to separate somebody from a community that's caused harm, the way I describe it is, there's a complete difference from when I show up in my native circles and I say, Ish Misha Ugan, Shale Gael Hanum, versus, oh, I'm Ugan and I'm Scottish descent. There's a complete difference in that carrying, even if someone just learns their introductions. But yes, so when it comes to language loss, has there been any studies as to what people do and the depression it's caused when people lose access to their languages, when they're not brought up with their languages? Now that we have schools that are, Gaelic first, is there comparisons from these same schools before they pressed Gaelic in how people are academically performing versus now that they have their Indigenous language and they're performing now? And those are the things that are going to push the language. And I would really like to see that research. Tapaletsa.
Egan, tapaletsa on Hisht, can you Kisht Ferris the Not an easy question to answer, Egan, but excellent questions. And I think questions that many of us identify with. We certainly are not going to answer them, not going to be able to answer them all tonight, if you'll forgive us. But again, I see a lot of comments coming up in the chat, which I think you might find interesting. I certainly do, just taking them in at the corner of my eye. Lewis, can I ask just for a very quick response to Egan there before we go? We do have a couple of other questions. And I might take just a quick word from you too, Peigi Ann, particularly in terms of the one language school and Gaelic medium education. To you first, Lewis.
Well, yeah, there was so much in what you said, Aidan. So many different issues. I think I just want to say the issues of you're not quite asking about this now, but the issues of Britannianism and Turtle Island are certainly strong. And, I think the lack of appreciation for people of the different nuances between Scots and Gael, etc. And that's a whole other caboodle. In terms of language and it is a healing thing to speak your language. And I know that even when I'm not in Aotearoa, if I can take some time to speak my language, that it speaks to the Māori, my soul, the life force, and it's a calming, soothing. It's so calming and soothing. I don't often have the luxury these days of being able to do that in place. But the more you, I think you know this in your being, the more you can speak your mother tongues, your Indigenous languages, the more that is like a balm that soothes inside, even when you cannot be in the places that you deeply belong and resonate. And I feel the pain of displacement. I know that pain of displacement. I just want to touch on before what's happened. We've had big debates in Aotearoa. There's been trying to teach Te Reo Māori, in a sense, it's got the corporatized and a bit generalized. And, of course, Te Reo Māori is specific to place, and the best place that it's learned is in the maraes, in your local hapu, in your local iwi, in your local gathering places, the places that are connected to the specific Indigenous knowledge. And there's also been a few politics around, Pākehā accessing it, which is great. We like Pākehā to speak Māori, but also that Māori need to be able to access the mother tongue. So that it's a few things, but I want to maybe Alistair or Peigi Ann, I know they'll have thoughts on language, and you've touched on so many things, Aidan, around displacement and placement. So it's just a little sprinkling.
Just a little sprinkler. Thank you very much, Lewis. Yeah, it's a huge topic. One other element of this huge topic we're dealing with tonight. Peigi Ann, as somebody who's come through Gaelic medium education, I think you've already made a couple of points in that regard, and maybe just specifically in the context of Megan's question.
I think about the schools, this Gaelic First is quite a new change. Usually in the Western Isles, when I was growing up, all kids went into the English and you had to opt into the Gaelic. So this is a change that's come about. And although it doesn't seem like much, it's quite a subtle change. I do think that it just does put Gaelic first. You have to make a bit of an effort now to opt out into the English. What I think is totally crazy, though, is that actually places in the lowlands, Glasgow and Edinburgh and Inverness, they have all Gaelic schools, and actually we in the Western Isles don't have that, which is to me completely insane, as the majority of people that speak Gaelic now as a community language live in the Western Isles and in Skye. We are seeing there's a school not far from me, and actually there has been no children opting into English, so the school has now become all Gaelic. But for some reason they don't publicize that, they don't give that any credit. I don't really understand why myself, but the changes are happening. But I would like to see in the very near future Gaelic schools in the Western Isles and Gaelic high school as well. There was a study done just a couple of years ago, and actually the people in the high school here, 75% of them said they would be in support of an all Gaelic high school. So it's something that I hope to see very soon.
Thanks very much, Peigi Ann. Alistair, is there a quick comment you want to add to any of this just now? You're muted, Alistair.
I think the only thing that I would add there on the language front is that when I was growing up in Lewis, and people would talk about Gaelic, they would think of it in a unidimensional way of being simply a means of communication. And therefore, ironically, within the church, within the Free Church and the Church of Scotland, you'd say to people, why don't you sing the Psalms in Gaelic more, because it is so beautiful? And they would say it doesn't matter what language you sing the Psalms in, it's what's behind them that matters. Now, the thing that's being missed there is that when you use the term Gaelic, it's actually far more than just a language or the means of communication. It is a whole cultural heritage that is embedded in place. And that, for the thing to survive and to have any reason to survive, is surely what matters. Because simply to have another language, I mean, you might as well learn Esperanto or something, unless it is embedded in what it means to be a people and what it means inclusively to be a people, to have ways in, so that it's not just an ever smalling, what the Native Americans called genocide by arithmetic, because your bloodline gets more and more diluted. But it's an expansive carrying stream that opens and carries people along with it.
Thanks very much, Alistair. Alistair McKinnon, I think, had a question on Dùthchas. Am I right, Alistair? Even where are you? I can't see you on my screen just now.
Hello?
Alistair, yes, you're with us.
Good evening. I think we need to remember something before I begin. The Dùthchas is a living thing. It's a living thing. We can get so easily distracted into an academic framing of it. It's ontology, it's epistemology. But what I'm looking at in a minute is a methodology. And how can we secure the Dùthchas? And I think a way that might be possible is going in the internal colonization route. And we start first with the Scottish Gaels. We then contact our sister organizations in Ireland and talk to them about the Gàidhealtachd, combining them both. We then make that bigger, and then we talk to the Isle of Man, Cornwall, Wales, the Breton, the Catalans, and the Basque. And we go en masse as a bloc to the United Nations and get articles written in on how we can get internal recognition for the colonization that's continuing today, and look at it from that lens. And then we can look at the Scottish government, the British government, and how the domination code is continuing. And if we can get recognized at UN, we can secure rights, land, and that will continue to kind of develop over time. It's a long-term project. It's not going to be easy. But I think if we can start at least around this arena this evening and look at that concept, Do you think this is even possible? Is probably my real question. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alistair, for a very easy question. Not that with 4 minutes to go of our allocated time. But let me just maybe just to kind of touch on it, if nothing else at this late stage. And again, some really interesting comments coming in. Alistair, could you maybe just in literally a minute or so give some response to Alistair McKinnon?
Well, I think you know we have to be so careful with this discussion, because people who don't feel part of it can easily see what we're talking about here. They can portray it as being something racist or exclusive, talk about blood and soil. It's not about that. It's about soil and soul. It's about our humanity. This is about, we're talking in Gaelic culture, and it is so clear if you look at something like Carmichael's Carmina Gaidhealtachd, especially in the full 6-volume original. It is so clear that we are talking about a culture here that is deeply about expressing our shared humanity, not individualistically, but in a shared way. And yet, ironically, in ways in which the individual can blossom because they are held in that basket of community. The warp of their lives that in modern life goes out at warp speed is interwoven in real community with the weft that binds it together into a fabric or a basket that can hold but not entrap. That is the culture we're talking about. That is why it's so important that this is not just about whether or not you speak Gaelic. This is about a much wider cultural carrying. And the reason why there's been so much stuff in recent years of connection with other Indigenous peoples, there's Catherine McPhee on screen there. She's just back from the Amazon. All kinds of connections going on there. The reason why that is happening is that when one Indigenous people, or one set of them, meets another, they recognize each other. They recognize each other almost instantly, because you've got that connection with the land and what it means to be more deeply human. You're not part of a society that is about competitive aggression, knocking each other out, but you're part of a society that is about helping one another to be human. And I would say that as my closing words. This is about what Paulo Freire calls full humanization, by decolonizing ourselves from those aspects that reduce our humanity because we cut each other off and compete rather than cooperate.
Thanks, Alistair. I think that's a good place to finish for tonight. There are loads of comments in the chat column, and I hope we have some way of capturing them, Luke and Anne. If there is, then it'll be wonderful. Thank you all so much for staying with us, being with us and staying with us tonight. The panel would have been almost pointless, not entirely pointless, had we just been speaking amongst ourselves, but that would have been a very, very precious thing to do too. So I would not have been too upset by it, but it was even better with all of you round the table with us. Last year, I was asked to speak at the opening of an exhibition in the local historical society, Gàidhealtachd, one of the very, very important things that we have across these islands in particular now in many communities, Ness, of course, being the first one. I have to mention that with respect to my dear friend Annie McSween. And I had just shortly before doing that talk, I had finished reading a book, you'll be interested, Lewis, which had come from Australia. Fiona had sent it to me from Australia, and it was by and about Indigenous peoples. And someone was being quoted in reference to their own heritage. And the statement was simple: when you look behind you, you see your future in the footsteps. I love that concept. And I hope that tonight's conversation has encouraged all of you to think about your relationship with your community and as you look behind you occasionally, the land that you live on, as has been referenced so often by our panelists. And that in considering our cultural and environmental heritage, we recognise that we all have a part to play in continuing these connections and contribute to a better future for the generations coming after us. I want to say a huge thank you to Lewis for her report, to Peigi Ann and Alistair for joining us tonight in conversation, for all the questions, for Luke and Anne for keeping this show on the road tonight. It would not have happened. Many thanks. And sorry, Slán, at that point, I'm not going to sing, you're going to be spared that, but that is the first line of a lovely song of parting that we often sing at Gaelic Céilís. That means essentially Godspeed and good night. Thank you all very much for being with us.